You're watching the National News Desk, America's News Now. Closer than ever, late October polling revealing a troubling trend for Democrats in the race to the White House. And recovering from Helene and Milton, Florida estimates the cost from the deadly disasters as the number of insurance claims continues to rise. And later, thousands of bottles of antidepressants recalled over a cancer-causing chemical. The new warning this week from the FDA. From the nation's capital, this is the National News Desk, America's News Now. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dee Gatton, and on this weekend edition, we take a look at the big headlines of the week, and we look ahead at what to expect, starting with the four big stories we've been following this week. The U.S. continues to support Israel in its war against Hamas. The new money now going to aid in Gaza. North Korean soldiers spotted in Russia. What the White House says about a possible involvement with the war in Ukraine. And the IRS announcing its inflation-adjusted tax brackets for 2025. What the new rules could mean for your money. But first, to the November 5th election, now just days away. And less than 2 weeks until Election Day, and the Republican National Committee says it has more than 200,000 volunteers ready to watch polls nationwide. That's according to the Washington Times. The committee launched what it calls its election integrity effort in June. Republican Party leaders also told the Associated Press it's working to rebuild a more skilled and organized legal operation. There is zero evidence that voting machines in Georgia are flipping votes. That's according to Gabriel Sterling, the chief operating officer for Georgia's Republican Secretary of State.
There's literally zero, and I'm saying this to certain Congress people in the state, zero evidence of machines flipping votes. And that claim was a lie through 2020, and it's a lie now.
His comments come after Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene claimed voting machines in the state were flipping votes. With days to go, who's in the lead in the race for the White House? It's a tricky question to answer, but as national correspondent Matt Gelka explains, October trends haven't been kind to Vice President Kamala Harris.
As the end of the election cycle gets closer, the focus of voters and campaigns shifts to the polls. The latest survey from the Wall Street Journal has former President Donald Trump up by 2 points over Vice President Kamala Harris, a flip from their August poll that showed Harris with a 2-point lead. Multiple polling averages show a tightening of the race through 3 weeks of October. Real Clear Politics had Harris with a 2-point lead October 1st, down to a 0.2 lead now. The New York Times average went from a 4-point Harris lead to a 1-point Harris lead this month. And Decision Desk HQ flipped their prediction from October 1st. When they gave Harris a 55% chance of winning, they now give the edge to Trump at 52%.
I think Kamala Harris has hurt herself with her strategies, her rhetorical strategies throughout. She doesn't appear to be interested in answering any questions well.
Polls from crucial swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan have also shifted to or have been locked in virtual dead heats.
You're worried if you're in either campaign because this could really go either way, and that's why we see the candidates really hammering in on those swing states.
The latest Wall Street Journal poll also found that more voters think Trump is, quote, too extreme by a 49-39 tally as opposed to Harris. 48% of those surveyed also said Trump was a danger to the country, compared to just 43% saying that about the vice president. Harris appears to be using that feeling in her closing arguments, agreeing with Trump's former chief of staff that Trump is a fascist.
And frankly, I think of it as he's just putting out a 911 call to the American people. Understand what could happen if Donald Trump were back in the White House.
Polling has gotten increasingly difficult with how divided voters have become, and a majority of polls keep falling within the margin of error, meaning really either candidate could be ahead right now. For the National News Desk in Washington, I'm Matt Gelka.
Uncertainty among small business owners is at an all-time high. That's according to a survey by the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Experts say worries about the election have forced businesses into uncomfortable holding patterns, which in turn could impact their bottom lines and the U.S. economy. The Federal Reserve says uncertainty should subside once the policy path becomes clearer, with a rebound in hiring and investments. New numbers now reveal the amount of claims filed after Hurricanes Helene and Milton. The Office of Insurance Regulation reports more than $2 billion in insured losses from Milton and over $1 billion in losses from Helene. Claim-wise, the state's insurance office says there have been a little more than 230,000 claims filed from Hurricane Milton so far. They say families have up to a year to file a claim for damages.
Obviously, the sooner you file that claim, then the faster it is that you can get the funding to begin the process of rebuilding.
The Office of Insurance Regulation estimates about 13% of the claims have already been closed, but they expect the number of claims to continue rising. The U.S. is providing another $135 million in aid to Palestinians in Gaza. Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced the new aid during a visit to Qatar, his 11th visit to the region since the Hamas-Israel war broke out. The U.S. has also been pressing Israel to let more aid into the war-ravaged enclave. United Nations humanitarian officials report harrowing levels of death, injury, and destruction in northern Gaza. Developing now, the White House has confirmed that North Korean troops are being trained in Russia. White House security spokesman John Kirby says the communist country moved at least 3,000 soldiers into Russia earlier this month. Kirby notes they don't know if these troops will fight alongside Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, but calls it a highly concerning probability.
After completing training, these soldiers could travel to Western Russia and then engage in combat against the Ukrainian military. We have briefed the Ukrainian government on our understanding of this situation, and we're certainly consulting closely with other allies, partners, and countries in the region on the implications of such a dramatic move.
Both Russia and North Korea deny any troop movement. Turning now to your money, new year, new tax brackets, and the numbers might surprise you. The IRS just announced its inflation-adjusted tax brackets for 2025, along with dozens of other provisions for next year. The National News Desk, Jeff Harris, explains.
One of, if not the biggest change coming next year is what's happening to the annual income threshold, which saw its smallest jump in several years. The IRS changes the threshold every year based on inflation, and since inflation has cooled, so is the adjustment.
Usha Ratcliffe, a finance expert at Emory University, tells us the biggest difference in 2025 compared to previous years is that the income tax brackets have been adjusted by 2.8%.
which is significantly less than prior years.
So what does this mean for someone who's going to pay taxes in 2025 compared to 2024? Ratcliffe says, for example, if you're a single person making $120,000 a year and taking a standard deduction, you will save some money.
Because of the changes in these tax brackets, you would save in your tax bill approximately $300.
And she says the same thing will carry over to married couples filing together as well.
So everybody will see, a little bit of savings in their taxes.
But Caroline Bruckner, a tax expert at American University, tells us these tax bracket adjustments aren't the only things changing in 2025. Different provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are also set to expire at the end of next year.
The changes on the individual tax side, they expire in 2025.
Which is why she believes while it's important to keep tabs on the tax bracket adjustments, next year there could be even more changes.
These are hugely important budgetary debates, and they will impact American families' kitchen table discussions.
Now, along with the tax bracket adjustments, the IRS also boosted figures for other provisions like long-term capital gains, estate and gift tax exemptions, and eligibility for the Earned Income Tax Credit. I'm Jeff Harris reporting from Washington.
The U.S. Centers for Disease Control found more than 3% of high school students now identify as transgender. Emma Withrow from the Fact Check team joins us now to discuss. So let's look at the numbers. How does this number compare to years past? Are more teens identifying as trans now?
Yeah, they definitely have been. The numbers are rising from what it looks like with the data. So according to this report from the CDC, 3.3% of the students they surveyed said they now identify as trans, and then 2.2% said they're questioning whether or not they're trans. A report from UCLA just a year prior found only 1.4% of teens identified as trans. So if the data is accurate, the number of trans teenagers has more than doubled in just the last year, which is astonishing.
Right. And how do these numbers compare to the amount of adults who identify as trans?
There's a total shift with the numbers there. So UCLA's report says about 0.5% of all U.S. adults identify as transgender. But what's interesting, though, with this number is it's actually decreased for adults. So it's having the opposite effect as what it's having for teens. So back in 2016, 2016, 0.6% of the adult population identified as trans. So it's definitely shifted for that age group, and you can see the difference there.
I'm sure we'll continue to have more research on this topic.
Yeah.
Emma, thank you. Later on, Emma will be back to break down the issues transgender youth are dealing with as described in the CDC's report. Israeli Defense Forces conducting retaliatory strikes on Iran directed at military targets early Saturday local time there. Iranian state-run Press TV reported several sounds of explosions heard in Tehran. Iranian security sources indicated those were related to the country's air defense systems, not necessarily Israeli missile strikes. Earlier in October, Iran fired a barrage of missiles at Israel after the killing of Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah. Ahead on the National News Desk, America's News Now. First-hand accounts, newly released 911 calls from the Trump assassination attempt revealing what happened on the ground. Plus, tracking the trends, early voting numbers are making new records. How an increase in turnout could give one party an edge. More than 18 million Americans have already voted, smashing early voting records. In the past, Democrats have held the edge on early voting, but this year we're seeing a surge in Republicans boosting those numbers. Joining Angelo Brown to discuss is RNC co-chair Laura Trump.
What do you think when you see the early voting numbers? Now, this is kind of like a little bit of a switch from 2020, when there were some questions, at least coming from Trump, regarding voter fraud and mail-in ballots. But now the former president just encouraging his supporters, his voters, to go out and to vote early. And it looks like the numbers appear to be backing that up.
Yeah, well, this is not just a switch from 2020, Angela. This is a switch really in anything we've ever seen in terms of early vote totals for Republicans. Traditionally, Democrats outpace Republican voters in in-person early voting numbers by around 80 to 20. And right now what we're seeing is that in a lot of states, a lot of these early vote battleground states, they're either just barely, Republicans are just barely edging out Democrats, or they're actually really beating Democrats. And I think we've really tried from the RNC and the Trump campaign to send the message out there that we want you to vote early. Look, there's stuff that happens in everybody's life. I have 2 young kids, whether you're a parent, whether you have a job, whether you get sick or there's a natural, weather phenomenon in your area, you never know what's going to happen. So we want to encourage people to bank their vote and go vote early. And obviously they have listened, and we've been very excited to see the numbers coming out.
You talk about the raw numbers here. We have them for you right here. 19 million people nearly around there have cast ballots. We also have a breakdown of what we're seeing in some of these states. Now, it's on the screen right here. You have nearly 30% in Pennsylvania. You have other states in Arizona and Nevada where Republicans are actually outvoting Democrats. And then you have close to 30% in your home state of North Carolina. Now, when you look at the percentages right here of people voting early Republicans, is there a certain percentage that you have in mind that you want to see from early voting going into Election Day that could mean a Trump victory?
Well, I think what it really means for us is no matter what that percentage is on Election Day, it's allowing us to turn out what we call low propensity voters. Okay. These are people who may not vote every election cycle. They may not have voted, in the past 2, 3, or 4 election cycles. But we know when they vote, they traditionally vote Republican. And so what this is allowing us to do is once people are voting that we have on our list in terms of people who are registered and we know are active participants in the process, we take them off our list after they vote. And then it allows us to take our resources and actively seek out those low propensity voters. And we believe that's a lot of who is turning out right now. But as we head closer to Election Day, the more people are voting and early voting that we have on our list, we're taking them off and we're plugging new people in. And I think that is really going to be the key for us this election. And we've been very excited to see what has happened so far.
Let's talk about, because you've been doing a lot of press lately. You were on the Breakfast Club with Charlemagne. I got to catch some of that. You're really trying to reach out to Black and Latino voters. And the numbers are showing, at least if you believe the polling, that Trump is polling better than other Republicans when it comes to maybe Black and Latino voting. So what is your internal polling telling you when it comes to those numbers, those voting blocks?
Well, I think that's right. And I think what people have realized over the past 4 years is that something has not been working in this country. And I think people, 80% of the country, no matter where you live and no matter who you are, says that the country is on the wrong track and people are ready for a change. And so we're delivering that message everywhere. Look, you've seen Donald Trump himself go to the Bronx. You've seen him in Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta. These are places where typically Republican candidates for president don't go, because people say, don't go there. It's a solid blue area. It's really not going to do anything for you. But Donald Trump himself has said, look, I'm going to go out and I'm going to ask for people's votes. I'm going to talk directly to the American people, and I will remind people how much better off they were when I was in office. He wants to work for every single American. And so, yeah, I was excited to be able to deliver that message on the Breakfast Club. And we're anywhere we can go and talk to a voter in this country, we are happy to go. And you've seen Donald Trump lead that charge.
Now, going back to voter turnout, despite recovery from Helene, your home state, North Carolina, saw a record turnout, I believe, on the first day of voting. But Trump is taking some heat just regarding the FEMA response and criticizing the FEMA response in that state. What is your response to people who say that criticism may actually hamper response?
Well, I think when I talk to actual people on the ground who live in these areas, it's been very frustrating for them because, the $750 that everyone heard about is actually a loan. You have to apply for that. Many people are not getting approved for those loans. And I think it's a bigger conversation about how we're spending our tax dollars. And I think when the American people are suffering in whatever way it is, especially in the wake of a natural disaster like a hurricane, and you see that we've dumped so much money, over $1 billion, into actually rehoming and resettling people who broke our laws to come here, I think it's very frustrating. And I don't think Donald Trump is the only person who's been talking about that. I do know those people in Western North Carolina need a lot more help. They are not recovered yet. And so we're hoping for the best for them. And I know that there have been a lot of folks in state, a lot of local people who've pitched in. And it actually has been beautiful to see the spirit of the state show up in such a way.
Yeah, seeing people come together to help one another is always remarkable. RNC co-chairperson Laura Trump, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Newly released 911 audio from the moment after a gunman fired shots at the now infamous Trump rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, give us firsthand accounts of what it was like for people on the ground. The National News Desk, Antra El-Nashar reports.
What happened? Gunshots at the Trump rally.
Yep,
Gunshots.
the police are on the way.
Well, you better get over here quick.
911 audio of the moments panic set in at the Butler Farm Show grounds on July 13th.
They just tried to kill President Trump. You might want to make a note of that.
We're now able to hear this audio because several news outlets sued Butler County to release it. Rally attendees terrified about what just happened to former President Trump and the people around them, like this woman whose husband was shot.
Hey, this is Allegheny County. I have a female on the line. Her husband was shot at the Trump rally. Go ahead, caller.
Paramedic service, Tim. I called Butler Hospital. He's not there. They told me to call 911. Please.
Don't hang up.
And this woman.
Hello, we have an emergency.
Okay,
We're at the Trump rally. We're in the field. We have a 90-year-old woman down.
She conscious right now?
She is. She doesn't know where she's at.
The release of this audio comes as multiple investigations, including an independent panel, a Senate committee, and a House task force pieced together what happened. Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Mike Kelly, whose district includes the site of the shooting, leads the bipartisan House task force, which just released its interim findings on the actions of Secret Service and local law enforcement leading up to and during the shooting.
Everything you look at that day was out of place from where the perimeters were set up, how we were going to communicate.
Retired Secret Service Special Agent in Charge, Frank Loveridge.
We are an agency in crisis, that we don't have the resources, the human resources, to staff properly all of our protective operations.
He says he wants to know who in management is responsible for these systemic issues and not being more strategic with technological assets.
There's cameras, intrusion detection that is out there, cameras with infrared.
Congress recently approved additional funding for the Secret Service, but experts and investigators agree money alone will not solve the shortcomings at the agency that allowed for now 2 attempted assassinations of former President Trump. On Capitol Hill, I'm Latrell Nashar for the National News Desk, America's News Now.
Just ahead, walking with residents, the city where officers are taking to the streets to talk about crime. Plus, fight for survival, how a New York teen saved his dad's life after a golf trip took a dangerous turn. The National News Desk team of reporters is bringing you the headlines from coast to coast. We're taking the pulse of America, and we begin in Nevada, where confusion over the mail-in ballot process is causing concern among voters statewide.
With your mail-in ballot, you kind of have to make sure you're reading the instructions before you start, and then follow instructions as you're going through. And then you have to be careful and follow the very important instructions.
With early voting for the 2024 general election kicking off over the weekend, Sandra Cosgrove, who started her nonprofit Vote Nevada to educate voters about elections, says she fears a lack of voter education could jeopardize a person's vote, such as keeping them from heading to the polls.
It worries me that that's what people would do, that they would feel like I don't have enough information to do the mail-in ballot, so maybe it's just too confusing and I'm just not sure what I'm doing. And so I'm just not going to vote.
One concern some Clark County voters have brought up is the fear that their ballot could be discarded for accidentally signing and marking a box indicating someone else assisted in filling out their mail-in ballot.
I could see that people could feel a little bit intimidated, but you have to remember that mail-in voting has more steps to it than going in person and voting.
In Baltimore County, Maryland, police officers are walking with residents to hear concerns about the recent uptick in crime in their community. Longtime residents were appreciative of the gesture, but say the police need to show up when it matters most.
My car was stolen twice, and for you to show up and tell me there's nothing you can do, that's a problem. Because if someone ended up getting hurt, then who's liable for that?
Police officials say they will continue to use every tool at their disposal to catch the thieves, adding that keeping the people of Baltimore County safe is a top priority. In New York, a father-son golf outing quickly turned into a fight for survival after 49-year-old John Crabb suddenly collapsed. After calling 911, his 15-year-old son Jack began performing CPR using techniques he learned in high school.
I was pretty scared. I was just praying the whole time, and then once we got to the hospital and I got to see him, and the doctor said CPR helped a lot.
The Crabbs are telling their story to encourage people to get CPR certified because you never know whose life you might save. Up next, unauthorized transfers. Ticketmaster users say their tickets are disappearing from their accounts. What could be behind the fraud and how to protect your account? Many Ticketmaster customers across the country say their tickets for events, they're disappearing. Customers report getting notifications that their tickets were transferred without their knowledge or authorization. Meantime, Ticketmaster's website has a warning about a third-party data security incident where customer emails could have been exposed. A cybersecurity expert says the breach could be linked to the issue.
Snowflake is a third-party data analysis tool. A lot of companies use it. They took data from their systems, put it into a third-party system, and that's where it was stolen.
Ticketmaster denies responsibility, saying it's the fault of the customer for having weak passwords. The grand reopening for arguably the most famous tourist attraction in Asheville, North Carolina, is now set for November 2nd. The Biltmore estate closed for more than a month after Hurricane Helene damaged the property. The grand house was not damaged, but low-lying parts of the main entrance and its farm flooded. The 250-room estate is the largest privately owned home in the U.S. and is well known for its winter holiday display. Ahead in our next half hour, hack attack. The foreign group that could be behind the hack of election websites across multiple swing states. Plus, economic effects. Trump's economic advisor breaks down the top issue for voters as the national debt continues to climb. You're watching the National News Desk, America's News Now. Catch us live weekdays from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. and 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Time, and anytime online at thenationaldesk.com. We'll be right back.
You're watching the National News Desk, America's News Now.
Down to the wire, the two key voting groups that could decide the balance of power in the Senate. Plus, the U.S. providing billions more to Ukraine, how much other countries are contributing, and where the money is going. And later, fighting fuel fatigue, Amazon's newest partnership that can put money back in your pocket the next time you fill up. From the nation's capital, this is the National News Desk, America's News Now. I'm Dee Dee Gatton. Thanks for joining us. This week, we learned Iranian hackers have probed election websites in multiple swing states. Microsoft says the hackers could be looking for vulnerabilities to influence the U.S. presidential election. The activity took place in April, but was just recently discovered by Microsoft analysts. The tech giant expects the Iranian hacking group to increase its activity as the election nears, given the group's history of election interference. A majority of Americans are anticipating post-election day violence. That's according to an Ipsos poll. 62% of Americans now say they believe the likelihood of post-election day violence to be somewhat or very likely, with 70% of Democrats and 59% of Republicans who agreed on the chances of violence. The findings reflect the country's growing fears of political violence in the wake of the Capitol riot. As Americans head to the polls this presidential election, they're also deciding the balance of power in Congress. Right now, Democrats hold a slim majority in the Senate, but some tight races could shake things up. National correspondent Acha El-Nashar reports on some of the seats up for grabs.
Emergency supplemental appropriation.
There's not much a president can get done without the Senate. It's why Senate candidates in tight races, like in Wisconsin, are getting almost as much hype as the presidential candidates.
They're going to need a Senate full of public servants like Tammy Baldwin.
Come on, Eric. We got to get this guy elected.
Incumbent Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin fighting to keep her seat from Republican challenger Eric Hovde. Recent polls show Baldwin's lead is narrowing. Next door in Michigan, Democratic Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin and former Republican Congressman Mike Rogers competing for the seat of retiring Democratic Senator Debbie Stabenow. Like in much of the country, the economy and winning over union voters are central focuses of the campaign.
This factory is being upgraded and will save 700 mid-Michigan auto jobs. But Mike Rogers says, I think it's a bad investment.
Wages keep falling, prices keep rising, and the liberals are making it worse.
For incumbent Democratic senators from more conservative states, Sherrod Brown in Ohio and John Tester in Montana, it's about convincing Republican voters to cross party lines.
Sherrod Brown is fighting back. He wrote a bill that Donald Trump signed to crack down on drugs at the border.
We got Democrats and Republicans in Montana, but they're all libertarians. They all love freedom. None of them want the government telling them how to live their lives.
Here's what the balance of power in the Senate looks like right now. So Republicans would only need a net gain of 2 seats to take the majority. But if former President Trump wins, they'd only need 1 because his vice president would be the tie-breaking vote. Republicans are essentially guaranteed to pick up a seat in West Virginia with the retirement of Senator Joe Manchin, a former Democrat. Where they could lose a seat is Texas. A new poll by Emerson College in the Hills shows incumbent Republican Senator Ted Cruz in a statistical dead heat with his Democratic challenger, Congressman Colin Allred. This and other competitive races may come down to just a handful of votes. In Washington, I'm Acha El-Nashar for the National News Desk, America's News Now.
A memoir titled Patriot by the late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is now on shelves. Navalny, a political prisoner, kept a secret prison diary that was smuggled out in parts during his captivity before his death in February. Navalny was Vladimir Putin's biggest challenger and gained a large following by exposing corruption at the Kremlin. His widow, Yulia, told MSNBC's Rachel Maddow Alexei's movement lives on.
Do you still believe that the collapse of the regime is inevitable and that Russia will be democratic one day?
Of course. How could I not believe Alexei sacrificed all his life for this? And I feel like I must continue his work.
Yulia has taken the mantle of opposition leader in his place and faces arrest if she returns to Russia. Navalny was just 47 when he died. G7 nations are providing Ukraine $50 billion in loans. The White House says interest earned on profits from Russia's frozen central bank assets will be used as collateral. The U.S. is providing $20 billion of that, and the rest is coming from the European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan. The United States loan will be split between helping Ukraine's economy and helping its military, which will require congressional action. Eli Lilly now suing vendors and medical spas nationwide, claiming they were selling copycats of their popular weight loss drugs. The products claim to contain tirzepatide, the main ingredients in Eli Lilly's drug Zepbound. The lawsuit accuses the vendors of false advertising and promotion, with one specifically making false claims about safety and possibly harming American consumers. The White House is making a push for free birth control days out from the election. Right now, health insurers cover the cost of prescribed contraception. This new rule would expand that coverage to over-the-counter methods like condoms, birth control pills, or morning after pills from drugstores. The rule could go into effect in 2025 if approved. If former President Trump wins the election, he could reverse it. For a second year in a row, home sales are on track for their worst year since 1995. New data shows existing home sales in September fell 1% from August to 3.84 million units. The National Association of Realtors says that's the slowest pace since 2010. September sales were also down 3.5% from a year earlier. High home prices and elevated mortgage rates are keeping many potential home buyers away. Just days away from the presidential election, and the state of the economy weighs heavily on voters' minds. Joining Angelo Brown to discuss is Trump economic advisor Steve Moore.
Let's talk about what's happening here. Despite the recent rise in wages being faster than inflation, that is happening under the Biden-Harris administration. Real median earnings remain in a downward trend, being below 1.3% of inflation since Biden took office. Now, could this be the reason why so many Americans, and we're seeing this in the polling, there's just so many Americans are really at this point just dissatisfied, according to polling, with the current state of the economy?
Yeah, I was just looking at some polling, Angela, yesterday that shows about 2/3 of Americans think the country is headed in the wrong direction, and that's a bad number. And I do think that chart that you have on the screen is explaining a little bit why that is. Now, there's good news and bad news on that chart. You can see that the red areas are the decline in people's incomes, and that was worst in 2021 and 2022. Remember when we had the 9% inflation? Right. Now, the good news is that inflation has really come down a lot, and thank God. But as that chart is showing you, people are still, on average, a little bit poorer today when you adjust for inflation in terms of their buying power than they were 4 years ago. I think that explains why people are still not in a great mood about their current economic condition.
And then a lot of people are not in a good mood also when it comes to the national debt, surging another $2.3 trillion. A favored Democratic solution, we've heard this over and over again for forever, that to make the rich pay their fair share, they say. Currently, the top 1%, according to some charts that we have, pay 45% of the federal income tax. You say this proposal wouldn't be enough. Why do you say that?
Yeah. I bet that chart probably surprises people because, we keep hearing that the rich don't pay their fair share. And we have a pretty progressive tax system. You can see 1% of people, that's 1 out of 100 richest, pay almost half of the income tax. That's a lot. And then, you see that the lower 50% don't really pay all that much of the income tax at all. So I think this chart is illustrative of the point that this mythology that, the Bill Gates and the Warren Buffetts and the LeBron James of the world aren't paying taxes. They're paying a lot of tax. I really think right now the problem isn't that we don't have enough tax revenues. You mentioned that $2 trillion deficit. I think it's an overspending problem. And I do like this idea that Trump has of putting someone like Elon Musk in charge of finding waste and fraud and abuse in the budget. And getting rid of some of that wasteful spending. I don't think people would even notice it was missing.
Some people, when we hear cutting, they always think about what Social Security and Medicaid, some of those entitlement programs that a lot of politicians simply just don't want to touch.
Right. And look, I think there's so much waste and redundancy in government programs. You don't have to cut people's benefits. You don't have to cut the programs that really matter to people. We need to just find programs that really aren't working or have been around for 100 years that aren't doing much. We still have a problem, by the way. We talked about this, Angelo, a few weeks ago, and the Washington Post had a story about this the other day. We still have a lot of federal workers who are not showing up for work, 3 or 4 years after COVID. So I do believe we could cut as much as $1 trillion out of the federal budget, and Americans in Main Street USA wouldn't even notice it was missing.
You know, there's some interesting U.S. Census data that just came out about state-to-state migration patterns in 2023, and we have kind of like a breakdown of that as well, where then twice as many Americans moved from California and New York to Florida and Texas than the other way around. And it doesn't seem like the weather here is a factor. What are some of the reasons people are moving to some of these states?
Yeah, this is really showing that California and New York are falling way behind Florida and Texas. And, you know, by the way, if these trends continue in the next 20 to 25 years, Texas could overtake California as the most state in America. We saw a few years ago that Florida now has more residents than New York. So, by the way, what do Florida and Texas have in common? They're both states that don't have a state income tax. So you have a lot of people, especially people with money, who are moving into those two states. And California and New York happen to have the highest income taxes in the country, and a lot of rich people are moving out of those states.
All right. Trump economic advisor and co-author of the new book, The Trump Economic Miracle, Steve Moore, of course. Thank you so much for joining us, as you always do.
A new report from the Centers for Disease Control found the number of transgender teenagers has more than doubled in just 1 year, with over 3% of high school students identifying as trans in 2023. Emma Withrow from the Fact Check team joins us to discuss this survey from the CDC. It also asked students about their mental health. How did these trans students respond?
Not very well. It was pretty stark to see the data. So according to the CDC, 26% of transgender and questioning students attempted suicide in the past year, compared to 5% of straight young men and 11% of straight young women. Also, the majority experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, which is obviously a clear marker for depression.
Right. Those are concerning numbers.
Yeah.
Does bullying at school play into any of this?
Yeah, the numbers were stark for that as well. Around 40% of trans or questioning students said that they were bullied, and then around a quarter of them said they just didn't want to show up to school at all for fear of facing that.
Right. And then, you know, trans students in housing, that was also explored. What does this report say about that? A connection in any way?
There's definitely a connection there for sure. So it found that they were 5 times more likely to experience unstable housing in the last month than straight students. So there was a lot of data compared. It was a very long report, but definitely disturbing numbers.
Emma, thank you.
Yeah.
And if you want to see more of that report and more on this Fact Check team topic, including links to their sources, scan the QR code on your screen or visit thenationaldesk.com. And still to come here, our team of correspondents breaks down this week in Washington, from the race to the White House to the balance of power in Congress.
Welcome back. Our Washington Bureau covers the nation's capital every day, and our team of correspondents reports on the important issues facing the country and how they impact you. Just over a week until Election Day, and polls continue to show the presidential race is statistically tied, though we've seen some slight movement in recent days. National correspondent Matt Galka, what's the state of play?
Yeah, Steve, you know, following a summer of obviously whirlwind events where Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee, she got a bump from the convention, and then we saw a presidential debate between her and Donald Trump, where a lot of the pundits said she won, and she got a boost from that. But since October 1st, the polls have really shifted away from her into that neck-and-neck race that you were talking about. In the New York Times poll averages, for instance, October 1st, she had a 4-point lead over the former president. That's down to 1. Other poll averages, 2-point lead down to 0.2 from Real Clear Politics. So we're continuing to see the same trend. And you might ask, well, what's going on here? Well, for number one, ads have taken effect. Ads, negative ads for both candidates, but people are now starting to see more of her, see more of her from ads, and see more of her from her media appearances that she's done. She's done a number of interviews with both friendly and unfriendly outlets. She's been under scrutiny. She's tried to answer questions. So all of these things have an impact. And really what it adds up to is a bunch of polls that basically say this thing is tied, everything's within the margin of error, and it's really anyone's race.
Right, and one of the things we'll be looking at after Election Day in the exit polls is when did people make up their minds? There's still a little over a week until Election Day, and we'll be looking at that number to see how many made up their minds in the last final week. Meanwhile, One question Kamala Harris has been asked during interviews and by voters is how a Harris presidency would be different than President Biden's. National correspondent Christine Frizzell, how has she been answering that question?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Steve, because the first time she was asked that sort of before a huge audience was on The View, and she said, you know, I can't really think of anything. We've since seen her sort of struggle to answer it. She said, you know, unequivocally, my presidency will be different. She's talked about how she's younger, hasn't been in Washington for 50 years like Joe Biden has, but she really has not provided a whole lot of details on what she would do differently. She's also struggled to answer questions about, you know, her proudest achievements being a part of the Biden administration, and also some of the things that she wishes she would change. So this is really important. You know, as Matt just mentioned, this is someone who's only been a candidate for about 3 months. This strange way that things have turned in the election. A lot of people simply want to get to know her. They want to get to know what she would do. They want to know what she would do differently. One thing I will say she has not had trouble doing is spelling out how she is different from her opponent, Donald Trump. She's really focused on that, but still has yet to have a really good answer when it comes to what she would do differently from the commander-in-chief.
Right, and it's not just the presidential races on the ballot this year. The balance of power in Congress is also at stake. National correspondent Atra El-Nashar, you've been covering what the Senate could look like come January.
Yeah, there's not much a president can do without buy-in from the U.S. Senate, so some of these candidates are being treated with almost as much hype as the presidential candidates at some rallies lately. Of course, we know right now Democrats have a slim majority in the Senate, so Republicans only need a net gain of 2 seats to take the majority, but if Trump wins, they'd only need 1 because his vice president would be the tie-breaking vote. So some competitive races, not surprising, are also in states that are very competitive for the presidential nominees. We're talking Michigan, we're talking Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, incumbent Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin's trying to keep her seat from a challenge by Eric Hovde, a Republican businessman. While over in Michigan, retiring Democratic Senator Debbie Stabenow is opening up this seat. So Alyssa Slotkin, a congresswoman from Central Michigan, and former Congressman Mike Rogers, a Republican, are competing. And that's a pretty close race. And just like the national race, the presidential race, the economy, winning over union workers is really central there. You've got 2 incumbent Democrats in Sherrod Brown in Ohio and John Tester of Montana who are in really competitive races. Naturally, those are more conservative states as well. So they're trying to prove that they can work across the aisle. And Steve, I want to leave viewers with one more race that we probably didn't think we'd be talking about this time last year, and that is Ted Cruz's Senate seat in Texas. If there's a home for Republicans, it's Texas. But a new poll out this week by Emerson College in the Hills shows he is basically neck and neck with his Democratic challenger, Congressman Colin Allred.
Right, and the numbers are looking good for Republicans at this point. Democrats need to run the table in the seats that they're defending, and perhaps if they can pick up a state like Texas, that'll help stop the bleeding for them, and maybe they could hold on to the Senate majority in the Senate next year. Atra, Christine, Matt, thank you all for your great reporting and your hard work. Back to you.
Up next here on the National News Desk, unaffordable operations. The lawsuit claiming Seattle tenant laws are hurting affordable housing. Plus, problem at the polls. The controversy in Texas after one man was nearly denied his right to vote over what he was wearing. This is the National News Desk, America's News Now. We have reporters all across the country in your neighborhoods covering issues that matter to you. From a lawsuit over affordable housing in Washington to a warning about Facebook Marketplace in South Carolina. We're taking the pulse of America, but we start in Texas with controversy over the shirt a man wore to go vote.
the judge there didn't like my shirt and told me to leave or not gonna let me vote.
According to a Texas state election code, electioneering is strictly forbidden at the polls. The law says it's illegal to, quote, post, use, or distribute political science or literature within 100 feet of a polling place.
He took a picture of me and asked the lady to get a copy of my voting, my ballot. And I told the cops about it, and it's just not right having a copy of my ballot.
Bexar County Elections Administrator Jackie Callanan says election judges are allowed to have their phones at polling locations, but it's never acceptable for them to ask to see a ballot. She adds Jones should have been made to cover up.
Some of our judges carry and have available jackets or sweaters and say, please cover it up.
Jones did not cover his Trump shirt, but was still allowed to vote after being pulled from the line 3 times.
Wearing this shirt is my right and my right to vote.
Addison on 4th underwent a major remodeling to make 254 affordable housing units available to some of Seattle's most vulnerable residents.
You know, the building's really improved since I've been here.
However, the building owner, GRE Downtowner, says its losses are mounting due to a series of ordinances that Seattle implemented to better protect tenants.
These laws have crippled GRE Downtowner's ability to provide affordable housing that is safe, clean, and healthy for their residents.
GRE Downtowner is now suing Seattle and showed how tenants sometimes trash their units while they wait out the eviction process.
The Addison no longer has enough revenue to pay its lender.
This is just moments before this trailer was stolen to be sold on the internet. The Richland County Sheriff Department is seeing more cases like this come across their desks. Investigator Stephen Head explains how the operations are working.
This particular case, they are using 1 stolen Facebook and 3 Facebooks.
Head tells me they lure buyers in first by using fake photos on social media. After they have a serious buyer, then the team shops for their next hit.
The other person, which there was 3 people we identified as the main, I guess you'd call them the actual ones that steal or the thieves, they would go out and take whatever it was. Now, a lot of these places that they hit are just houses in the middle of nowhere.
Still ahead, cutting costs for the holidays, where you can save on items like home goods and beauty through December. Target is now slashing prices on 2,000 of its items ahead of the holiday season. From home goods, beauty products, toys, and food and beverage items, some prices have already dropped and will stay that way through December. This is the second price cut this year. It's in an attempt to lure in inflation-weary shoppers, and the discounts help boost customer spending after a string of dreadful quarters for the company. Amazon Prime members can now access fuel discounts at 7,000 gas stations across the U.S. The move brings the program closer to Walmart Plus, which has offered discounted gas for years. To activate the benefit, users need to connect their Prime accounts to Earnify, BP's loyalty program. The discount comes out to 10 cents per gallon, which Prime estimates will save customers $70 per year. That'll be all for us on the weekend edition of the National News Desk, America's News Now. Don't forget, you can catch us live from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. and 10 p.m. to midnight Eastern Time. Check your local listings. Also, watch us online and catch up with the latest headlines on thenationaldesk.com. Thanks for watching the weekend edition of the National News Desk. I'm Dee Dee Gatton, and from all of us here, have a great week.